Imagine this. An old man, grey-hailed, trembling, leaning on a cane, walks into the emergency room. His chest tightens, his breath comes in ragged gasps, and his eyes plead for help. But instead of being led to a hospital bed, he's stopped. "Sorry, sir, you don't have insurance. We can't admit you without coverage." He collapses onto a chair, his frail hands clutching his chest, gritting his teeth through the pain. No one notices. Not a glance of sympathy. Not a hand reaching out. He sits there, silent, alone, as if the whole world has forgotten him. And then, a dusty pickup truck rolls up. The door swings open. A man steps out, not wearing a doctor's coat, not flashing a badge of authority, just a solid, weathered figure with salt and pepper hair and piercing eyes. Chuck Norris. He doesn't say much. He simply looked directly at the people trying to turn away, trying to hide, trying to brush off responsibility. And then he says exactly 5 words. 5 words that make the entire hospital freeze, make the whole system tremble, and change the life of that old veteran forever. "I'm here to settle honor. Are you ready to hear the rest? Because this isn't a story about a fight, not about fists, guns, or explosions. It's about what makes us human: loyalty, honor, and debts that should never be left behind." That afternoon, the wind in Pinebrook seemed to hold its breath, the whole town huddled under a gloomy sky heavy with grey clouds. Late-season maple leaves drifted down, touching the pavement with the sound of unheard sighs. Frank Delaney sat behind the wheel of his battered old truck, calloused hands gripping the worn leather steering wheel. The vehicle groaned in protest with every turn, its engine coughing along with its aging owner. A sharp pain in his left chest crept down his arm, not the first time, but today it was different, deeper, heavier, like an invisible hand squeezing his heart. Frank wasn't the kind to complain. For over 40 years he'd survived war, fought through PTSD, endured sleepless nights, and shaky hands from cheap painkillers. But today's pain made him, for the first time, feel afraid. "D-Well? Guess I won't go down that easy, old man. What you scared of?" he mumbled, half mocking, half reassuring himself, turning the truck toward Pinebrook Hospital. That little hospital, tucked on the edge of town, was a place Frank had only gone before, to say goodbye. Old war buddies, neighbors even frailer than him, they'd all ended their days here. Frank had never thought he'd one day drive himself there, not to visit, but to beg for help. No, had stepped through after the shooting. The parking lot was only a few dozen steps from the ER entrance. But today, every step was a battle. His legs trembled, his heart pounded like a chaotic war drum. By the time Frank reached the door, sweat soaked through his shirt. He braced himself against the brick wall, gasping for breath. Inside, the ER wasn't full, but it wasn't empty either. A receptionist clacked away at a keyboard. A young nurse named Sophie, maybe in her 20s, brown hair tied back, was checking the pulse of an elderly patient. Frank shuffled to the front desk, his voice raspy. "I need a doctor. My heart's not right." The receptionist didn't look up. "Name and insurance card." "I'm Frank Delaney. I don't have insurance, but I have cash." He pulled out a frayed leather wallet and extracted a few folded $20.00 bills. The woman frowned slightly, typed something, then sighed. "I'm sorry. Without insurance, we can't admit you unless it's an immediately life-threatening case." Frank gripped the edge of the counter. "I'm having chest pain. Isn't that clear enough?" From across the room, Sophie heard. She looked up and caught his eyes, and in that split second, just a few seconds, she saw something beyond the pain. She saw the loneliness of a man who once sacrificed and once believed in duty, but had been forgotten by the world. "I'll call a doctor to see if they can do a preliminary check," the receptionist said, her tone routine. "Meanwhile, please take a seat over there." Frank said nothing. He shuffled to a chair by the window. Every step dragged the weight of his past. Old trenches, midnight screams, the soldiers he once carried on his back under gunfire, and now no one was carrying him away from the pain gnawing inside. Sophie pulled off her gloves and walked toward the reception desk. "Aren't you calling a doctor?" "Not an urgent case." "Did you even look at his face? Look at his hands. They're shaking like he's in shock." "Sophie, I'm just following policy. No insurance, no doctor." Sophie turned away, heart tangled in knots. She remembered her father, also a veteran, who died when she was 12. He once told her, "War doesn't kill people with bullets. It kills them when society forgets them." She looked at Frank. He had slumped against the chair, eyes closed, hand clutching his chest. She walked closer. "Sir." Frank opened his eyes and forced a smile. "Don't worry, little one. I'm just tired. Do you have any family I can contact?" He fumbled through his pocket, slowly pulled out a small crumpled slip of paper and scrawled on it, "Charles N. Phone number." Sophie didn't know why she did it. Maybe because of his eyes. Maybe because of the trembling hands that still tried to hand her his last bit of trust. She called. The line rang for a long time. Then a deep, steady voice answered. "Who is this?" "Don't!" "Sorry, I'm Nurse Sophie at Pinebrook Hospital. I'm caring for a patient named Frank Delaney. He gave me this number, said Charles N. I don't know if..." The voice cut her off. "This is Chuck Norris." Sophie fell silent. "How's Frank?" "He's having chest pain, very weak, but the hospital's refusing to admit him because he has no insurance." Pause. Then Chuck's voice, calm but firm. "Keep him awake. I'm coming." Sophie thought it was a joke, but something in that voice made her believe. And not even 40 minutes later, a dusty silver pickup truck screeched to a stop in front of the hospital. A man stepped out, no introduction needed. Doctors passing by froze in place. A security guard whispered, "Holy crap, Chuck Norris." He didn't hurry, but every step he took was a silent declaration. His gaze swept across every face, stopping at Frank, the man struggling on the chair, breathing harder than ever. Chuck knelt down, his firm hand resting gently on Frank's shoulder. "Frank." Frank opened his eyes, murmured through the haze, "You really came. Always when you need me." Sophie watched, feeling like history had quietly come alive. No guns, no battlefields. Just two men who once fought together, now facing a new enemy, the coldness of the modern world. Chuck stood and walked to the reception desk. "I want Frank admitted to emergency care immediately." The receptionist stammered, "Sir, but without insurance." Chuck didn't get angry. He simply said 5 words. "I will cover it all." Sophie froze. Tears welled in her eyes, not because of the presence of an action star, but because she had just witnessed something she thought the world had lost. Unconditional human decency. And somewhere outside, the grey clouds began to part, letting a thin beam of light stretch across the horizon. Evening fell over Pinebrook without warning. The neon lights on the hospital's old sign flickered faintly. The E in emergency had long since gone dark, leaving only a patchy red glow reflecting on the oil-stained parking lot. Inside the waiting room, the air felt suffocating. Sophie stood by the reception desk, eyes fixed on Frank Delaney, the elderly veteran slumped on the chair, breath labored, eyes half closed, his worn face lined with the scars of a life surviving the worst. She had tried to convince the shift director to admit Frank, but was met only with cold headshakes and scripted answers, a solid wall of no insurance, no eligibility, no exceptions. Sophie's fingertips trembled as she redialed the number Frank had given. She had thought it a hopeless call at first, a way to ease the mind of a man about to fall, but the voice on the other end, steady and deep, didn't sound like a man who jokes. "Keep him awake. I'm on my way." She barely had time to ask his name. barely had time to wonder who he was. But the roar of the pickup truck outside, less than 40 minutes later, answered everything. The dust-covered truck screeched to a halt at the hospital door, and the man stepped out, grey hair lifting slightly in the night breeze. He didn't glance around, didn't react to the whispered, "Oh my God, it's Chuck Norris," from the younger nurses or the patients waiting nearby. He just walked straight, slow, each step striking the floor like a hammer. When Chuck Norris knelt beside Frank, laying a light hand on the old man's shoulder, the whole waiting room seemed to freeze. Frank offered a faint, cracked smile, his dry lips trying to form a few words. Sophie, standing close, caught the faint murmur. "You still remember me, Chuck?" "Always, Frank. We never leave a brother behind." Sophie turned away, eyes stinging. She didn't fully understand the bond between two men shaped by war, but she could feel it in that little room. Something deep, beyond paperwork, beyond protocol, beyond law. Chuck rose and walked straight to the front desk, where the young receptionist sat, pale-faced. He didn't raise his voice, didn't pound the counter. He simply placed both hands on the desk, leaned in slightly, and spoke quietly, his words heavy as iron. "I will cover all costs. Admit Frank now." The receptionist glanced around, stammering, "Sir, I don't have the authority. I need to call the director." "Then call him." Chuck's eyes didn't waver. In the back office, Shift Director Paul Reed, a middle-aged man in a sharp suit, neatly combed hair, stepped out, wearing the polite smile of someone used to handling power and money. "We're honored to meet you, Mr. Norris," Reed said, extending a hand. Chuck didn't shake it, he just stared straight into Reed's eyes. "I'm not here for pleasantries." Reed hesitated but quickly recovered. "I understand, but our hospital has rules. Without insurance, we can't admit patients unless they're in cardiac arrest or have life-threatening injuries right now. Your friend, by preliminary check, hasn't reached that point." Sophie clenched her fists, her lips tight. She heard every word, and her blood boiled. And spoke in a whisper. "Do you know who he is?" Chuck asked, his voice. "Yes, I know," a veteran. "We respect that, but the healthcare system doesn't run on respect. It runs on contracts, costs, and paperwork. I trust you understand, Mr. Norris." "No," Chuck said, his gaze hardening. "I don't understand. Because Frank Delaney isn't just a veteran. He's the man who saved my life. If it weren't for him, I wouldn't be standing here today, and if he dies here because of some damn paperwork, I won't let it go quietly." Reed gave a strained smile. "Mr. Norris, I understand your feelings, but let's be realistic." Chuck tilted his head. "Here's reality." He pulled out his phone, pressing a speed dial. Sophie glanced over and saw the screen flash. Colonel J.T. Alvarez. "Dia, it's me. I need a file. Frank Delaney. Yes, Special Ops 1976, Southeast Asia." "Send it now." "I'm waiting." Reed began sweating. What are you doing?" Chuck ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. His eyes stayed locked on Reed's. "You know the difference between a celebrity and a real hero, Reed?" Reed stammered. What's that?" Chuck's voice dropped, just loud enough for Reed to hear. "A celebrity makes headlines. A real hero is remembered by the military forever." Minutes later, a military vehicle rolled up outside the hospital. A uniformed man stepped out carrying a thick folder. He walked straight into the lobby, set the file down, tapped it lightly, and swept his gaze over the stunned hospital staff. "Classified file. Urgent support request?" Reed turned pale. Sophie noticed his hands trembling. Chuck picked up the file and flipped it open in front of Reed. Inside weren't just military records. There were notes. Frank Delaney participated in a secret rescue mission pulling a U.S. Special Forces team out of enemy encirclement. never officially recognized. National honor. Reed stuttered. I need to call the board. No. Chuck cut him off. You need to call a doctor right now. The atmosphere in the lobby shifted sharply. Nurses began whispering. Doctors exchanged glances. Patients and families perked up, some even pulling out their phones to record. The entire Pinebrook Hospital seemed to be drawn into the eye of an unexpected storm. Frank still lay on the chair, eyes barely open. Sophie rushed over, gripping his hand. Mr. Frank, hold on. You're about to be saved. Frank opened his eyes, looked at her, and gave a faint, tired smile. You're good, girl. Don't let these people harden your heart. Sophie's heart tightened. For a moment, it felt like she was seeing her own father, long gone, whispering those words to her. Suddenly, a doctor hurried over, pushing a gurney. We're moving the patient to the ER right now. Chuck stepped back, arms crossed, his gaze softening. Reed approached, lowering his voice. Mr. Norris. I'm sorry. I didn't know. Chuck gave a slight nod. Now you do. And I hope you won't forget. Frank was wheeled away, Sophie running alongside to assist. Chuck stood alone in the lobby, his shadow stretching long across the cold tile floor under the yellow lights. Outside, Pinebrook's night remained quiet, but something had shifted, not because of fame, not because of money, but because one man refused to let his brother die in silence. Chuck pulled out his phone, sent a short text. It's done. No one gets left behind. The message sent, Chuck slipped the phone back, let out a slow breath, and stepped out into the expanding night sky where the stars were just beginning to twinkle, like old memories, quietly glowing even when the world forgets. Inside the emergency room, Frank Delaney lay quietly on the hospital bed, pale overhead lights casting a ghostly glow on his weathered face, his eyes half closed, occasionally wincing as a dull pain radiated through his chest. Hastily applied electrodes stuck to his chest, and the heart monitor beeped faintly, steady but weak. Sophie stood in the corner, clutching her clipboard tightly, trying to hide her shaky breathing behind her mask. Standing just outside the glass window, Chuck Norris stood with his arms crossed, his deep-set eyes watching every movement in the ER. No one dared approach him, no one dared speak. Even Paul Reed, the shift director, usually so confident in controlling everything, now kept his distance, quietly swallowing his growing anxiety. Chuck said nothing. He just watched Frank, that old soldier, as if looking right through the glass, through the fading heartbeat, back into a distant memory where fire, blood, and unspoken oaths still burned. More than 40 years ago, in a rain-soaked jungle in Southeast Asia, the mud clung to their legs and gunfire echoed through the night. A young Chuck Norris, commanding a covert operations team, silently advanced on their objective. Everything was going according to plan until an explosion tore it all apart. Chuck was thrown into a pit, his head slamming against a rock, dazed. Through the haze, he heard shouting, gunshots, and cries for help. And then someone pulled him up. "Get up, sir, we can't stay here." A strong, steady hand grabbed him, dragging him out of the pit. Frank Delaney, just a transport soldier, not special forces, but he had risked everything, sprinting through the hail of bullets to save him. Frank pulled Chuck, inch by inch, dodging flying rounds, until they reached the edge of the jungle, where the rescue helicopter touched down. Chuck could still remember Frank's eyes, wide with fear yet fiercely determined. When the team escaped, Frank didn't get a single word of praise or a medal. It was a classified mission. His name was erased from the records. Frank came home to a quiet life, carrying invisible wounds in his heart and mind. And Chuck built a career, became a symbol, a hero, a face on the movie screen. But deep down, He never forgot that man, who traded his life for his. He did not like the thought of his Sophie stepped out of the ER, pulling off her gloves, her eyes red. Chuck turned to her. How is he? Dive. Stable for now, Sophie whispered. We've managed to stabilize his heartbeat, but the doctor says he needs a coronary stent surgery as soon as possible. Without it. Chuck gave a slight nod. You've done well. Sophie bit her lip, looking down. I don't know why I did all this. I should have followed the rules. I should have stayed out of trouble. Chuck looked at her for a long moment, then gently placed a hand on her shoulder. You didn't do it for praise. You did it because you knew what was right. At the end of the hallway, Paul Reed was on the phone, his voice tight. Chuck's eyes darkened. He strode over. What are you doing, Reed? Reed hurriedly hung up, forcing a polite smile. I was just contacting hospital management. We need to discuss surgery costs, insurance records. I'm sure you understand, Mr. Norris. Chuck's mouth curved slightly. Have you ever heard of the 1976 mission, Reed? Reed froze, confused. I'm not sure. That was the mission where Frank Delaney saved my life. That was also the mission that erased his name from all records, stripped him of recognition and denied him benefits. He came home a ghost, while I became a public figure. Chuck's voice lowered, every word landing like a hammer. Hasn't asked for a thing for 40 years? And now, when he needs saving, you're counting every penny on him? Reed swallowed hard, sweat beading on his forehead. I don't have the authority. I'm just the shift director. Then call someone who does. Chuck's voice turned steely. Call the board. Call the shareholders. Call the hospital council down here. I'll wait. Reed fumbled with his phone, stammering, Yes, I'll handle it. Chuck turned back, exhaling slowly, his gaze softening when he looked toward the ER. Frank still lay there, chest rising and falling faintly. Sophie stood at his side, gripping his frail hand. Outside the hospital, headlights flickered as a group of sharply dressed people arrived, polished shoes clicking against the floor. The Pinebrook board had arrived. Chuck strode to the lobby, meeting them with a level stare. Let's talk. The night at Pinebrook was no longer calm. News had leaked. Reporters hovered near the hospital gates. A group of local veterans, hearing that Frank Delaney had been admitted, began gathering, carrying American flags, old jackets, and calloused hands clasped firmly together. In the hospital's conference room, cold white lights cast tense shadows over the board members' faces. Chuck stood opposite them, unwavering. Frank Delaney isn't just an uninsured patient, Chuck said, his voice slow and deliberate. He is a symbol for every person who's sacrificed quietly. If you let him die just because of money, I guarantee this won't stay a local story. One council member spoke up in a soothing tone. Mr. Norris, we understand, but medical costs can't run on emotion. We have procedures, obligations to our shareholders. Chuck let out a soft, humorless laugh. I've heard those same words on the battlefield. Officers sitting safely in bunkers, calculating rations, bullets, lives. Meanwhile, Frank and I were out there, where bullets fly and blood spills for real. You calculate here with paper? I calculate with lives. No one spoke. Chuck stepped closer, his gaze hardening. Now, make your choice. Do the right thing. Or wait until the news spreads, and people start asking, why did a hospital let a veteran die just because he had no insurance? A long, suffocating silence. Finally, the board chairman took a deep breath and nodded. We will approve the costs. We will allow the surgery immediately. And we will review internal policies. Chuck gave a slight nod. Good. Now, say Frank. As Frank was wheeled into the operating room, Sophie walked alongside, her heart pounding. The surgeon gave her a reassuring pat on the shoulder, murmuring, "You did well, kid." Chuck stood outside the hallway window, watching through the glass. Inside, an elderly veteran lay surrounded by people fighting to keep him alive under the harsh, bright lights. Chuck exhaled slowly, his eyes softening. In that moment, he knew it doesn't take fame, money, or power to do the right thing. Sometimes, it only takes not forgetting a debt of honor. Outside the hospital, dawn was breaking. Thin beams of pale sunlight pushed through the grey sky. The veterans stood in silence, shoulder to shoulder, holding their flags, waiting. They didn't need banners, they didn't need chants. They simply stood there, reminding the world that no soldier is ever forgotten. Chuck Norris gave a faint smile, closing his eyes, remembering the past. In the distant jungle, the young soldier who had dragged him out of a crater, the unspoken promise that had never left his heart. "I owe you my life, and I will repay it." That morning in Pinebrook began unlike any other. Sunlight slipped through thinning clouds, shining down on the hospital's front, where a small group had gathered. No cameras, no reporters, no grand speeches, just veterans with worn jackets, local townspeople, nurses, doctors, and Frank Delaney. Frank sat in a wheelchair, a thin blanket over his lap, his face pale and drawn, but his eyes gleaming with simple joy. In one hand, he held a small flag. On the other hand, he tightly gripped Sophie's hand, the young nurse who had stepped in at the right moment. In front of the crowd, a bronze plaque gleamed in the morning light, mounted on the hospital wall. Ikaizo Barrows, in honor of the unsung, for all who served in silence. Pinebrook Emergency Department commits. We heal people, not just paperwork. Applause rose, not loud or flashy, but firm and genuine, like the steady heartbeat of a community awakened from a long sleep. Frank lifted his head, his eyes sweeping across the crowd, then stopping. Across the street, leaning casually against a dusty silver pickup truck, stood Chuck Norris, arms crossed, a light smile on his face. Frank raised his hand, holding the small flag aloft, his hand shaking but resolute. Chuck gave a slight nod, his right hand briefly pressing to his chest, a short gesture that Frank instantly understood. "Salute, brother." Sophie watched the moment, feeling her throat tighten. In that instant, she realized she had learned a lesson no classroom could teach, no textbook could explain, but that every heart can understand. Courage isn't just standing at the edge of life and death. It's daring to do what's right, even when the whole system tells you to stay silent. The ceremony ended, and people slowly dispersed. Sophie turned to Frank, gently asking, "Do you want to go back to your room now?" Frank gave a soft chuckle. "No, I want to sit outside for a bit." "But the doctor said—" Frank squeezed her hand lightly. "Young lady, it's a beautiful day. Let me enjoy it a little. Can we?" Sophie smiled, nodding. Of course. She wheeled him to the sidewalk, where he could see the trees, the sparrows hopping on the ground, and the passers-by chatting and laughing. A world he had nearly missed seeing again. Frank looked around, then smiled softly. "Sophie." "Yes. You know, I used to think I was useless. Came home, no one needed me. The things I knew, the things I saw, no one wanted to hear. I was ready to take it all to the grave." He paused, breathing slowly. "But today, thanks to you, thanks to Chuck, I realized some truths aren't meant to be buried forever. Some things need to be spoken, not to cause trouble, but to set things right." Sophie nodded, eyes glistening. "You've taught me so much, Mr. Frank." Frank smiled warmly. "Tell me, why did you become a nurse, Sophie?" She bit her lip. "Because I wanted to help people." Frank gave a small nod, squeezing her hand. "Then remember this. Never let anyone teach you how to help by making you count the money first. Across the street, Chuck Norris walked slowly toward his truck. He opened the door, sat behind the wheel, and gently ran his hand over the steering wheel. His phone, resting on the passenger seat, buzzed. A text from JT. Yedia Harper has signed papers to withdraw from the board. The Department of Defense has opened an investigation into old military contracts. I know you hate politics, but you just scored one hell of a takedown, Chuck. Chuck chuckled softly, tapping out a brief reply. Just paying a debt, he said. He looked through the window and saw Frank raising his hand in farewell from across the street. Chuck raised his own hand back, smiling faintly. Then he started the engine, rolling the truck slowly out of town, blending into the quiet evening roads. Behind him, Pinebrook still shone with lights. But now it wasn't just a place of forms, policies, and protocols. It had become a place where one man's stand had reminded everyone that sometimes it only takes one voice saying enough to make the whole system bow its head. Chuck Norris drove on, needing no applause. He was used to disappearing into the background, leaving behind changes for which others would get credit. But maybe that's how real heroes pass through this world, quietly, without fanfare, but leaving behind ripples that never fade. The sky over Pinebrook that evening was unusually clear. Thin clouds drifted lazily, morning sunlight spreading gently over rooftops, across the small familiar streets lined with aging trees shedding their leaves. In front of Pinebrook Hospital, a small group quietly gathered. No cameras, no reporters, no banners. Just veterans with frayed jackets, local townspeople, a few nurses, doctors, and Frank Delaney. Frank sat in his wheelchair, a thin blanket across his lap, hollow-cheeked but smiling, with simple joy. One hand held a small flag, the other gripped Sophie's hand tightly. Mounted on the hospital's outer wall, the bronze plaque gleamed in the morning light. For those who served in silence, in honor of all who have given in quidic sacrifice. Pinebreak, emergency depector promise. We treat people, not just paperwork. The applause was firm, steady, heartfelt, like the solid beat of a community awakening after a long, heavy sleep. The ceremony wrapped up, and people slowly began to drift away. Sophie turned to Frank, gently asking, "Would you like to go back inside and rest now, Mr. Frank?" Frank gave a soft, tired laugh. "No, I'd like to sit out here a little longer. But the doctor said you should." Frank lightly squeezed her hand. "Sweetheart, it's a beautiful day. Just let me enjoy it for a moment, please." Sophie smiled, eyes a little misty, and nodded. "Of course." She pushed his wheelchair toward the sidewalk where Frank could watch the trees sway, the little sparrows pecking at seeds, and the townspeople strolling by with their everyday laughter and chatter. It was a world he had almost left behind, a world he could now simply sit and watch again. Frank gazed around, then quietly spoke. "You know, Sophie, I used to think I didn't matter anymore. Came back home, nobody needed me. The things I'd seen, the things I knew, nobody wanted to hear. I thought I'd just carry it all to the grave." He paused, taking a slow, careful breath. "But today, because of you, because of Chuck, I realized some truths aren't meant to be buried forever. Some things need to be told, not to stir up trouble, but to help put things right." Sophie blinked back tears, nodding softly. "You've taught me so much, Mr. Frank." Frank smiled warmly at her. "Tell me, Sophie, why did you become a nurse?" She bit her lip, thinking. "Because I wanted to help people." Frank gave a faint nod, his wrinkled hand gently squeezing hers. "Then promise me this. Never let anyone teach you to help people by making you count the money first." Across the street, Chuck Norris walked slowly to his truck. He opened the door, settled into the driver's seat, and ran his fingers lightly over the steering wheel. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat. A message from Lydia Harper has resigned from the hospital board. The Department of Defense has launched an investigation into old military contracts. I know you hate politics, but you just landed one hell of a takedown, Chuck. Chuck let out a soft chuckle, typing back a short reply. I was just paying my debt. Through the windshield, he saw Frank from across the road raising a trembling hand in farewell. Chuck raised his own hand in return, a small, bittersweet smile flickering on his face. Then he started the engine, guiding the old truck out of town, blending quietly into the long, open roads. Behind him, Pine Brook still gleamed under the morning sun. But now, it was no longer just a place of forms, policies, and cold rules. It had become a place transformed, a place reminded that sometimes all it takes is one person standing up, saying, enough, and the whole system has no choice but to listen. Chuck Norris drove on, needing no applause, no headlines. He was used to fading quietly into the background, leaving behind a trail of change for which others would get credit. But, perhaps, that's how real heroes pass through this world. Quietly, without fanfare, yet leaving ripples that will never fade. 3 weeks later, Sophie received a small package in the hospital mailroom, no return address. Inside was a finely crafted silver badge engraved with the words, "For those who served in silence." Tucked beside it was a handwritten note. "Never forget what's right. When you need me, call." Sophie laughed softly, tears slipping down her cheeks as she pressed the little note to her chest. Frank Delaney was moved to a veterans' nursing home, where he spent his afternoons telling stories to the young volunteer kids. Stories of war, of old friends, and of one man who had never left his side, even when the world had turned away. And Chuck Norris? No one knew exactly where he went. Some said they saw him driving through Texas, stopping at roadside diners, sharing quiet conversations with old soldiers. Some swore they spotted him in California visiting a small hospital, leaving behind an anonymous donation. Others claimed they saw him at a gas station, quietly paying for a young mother who couldn't fill her tank. No one could confirm. But those who had met him, even briefly, all said the same thing. Chuck Norris didn't need camera lights. He didn't need applause. He only needed to know one thing: wherever there was a forgotten soul, wherever someone had been left behind, he would find his way there, quietly, leaving no trace, except a world slightly better than before. And somewhere, on endless highways under the setting sun, the faint sound of rolling tires whispers a quiet reminder. Honor isn't something you wear for show. Honor is what you leave in the hearts of others, never fading, never gone. So there it is. Not every kind of justice comes from the courtroom. Not every debt is written down on paper. Some debts live only in the heart. Debts that time can't erase, distance can't diminish, and death can never take away. Frank Delaney, the nameless veteran, survived, not just because of doctors or nurses or medicine. He survived because of an old friend. Man who never forgot a promise. And Chuck Norris? He didn't need anyone's thanks. He didn't need applause. He didn't need a place on a podium. He simply walked away, as he always did, leaving behind a hospital forever changed, a community awakened, and a timeless reminder. Honor isn't something you show off. Honor is something you quietly keep. To the very end. If this story touched your heart, share in, because maybe, just maybe, you too will become someone's quiet hero. One day when they least expect it.